Good afternoon, and welcome to the Creating the Basic Plan webinar. My name is Laura Stone, and I will serve as your host for this webinar. This afternoon, your presenter is Boyce Wilson. Boyce is the Emergency Preparedness Planner for the Heart of Texas Council of Governments, Homeland Security Division, and chairperson for the FEMA Region 6 Community Preparedness Working Group. For the past decade, Boyce has worked with local, state, and federal partners to enhance community preparedness for the whole community. Boyce also works closely with schools to integrate youth preparedness programs to support school and whole community preparedness. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few ground rules. First of all, the chat feature is located at the bottom right corner of your screen. Should you have a question, type your question in the chat box. If we are able to address your question right away, we will do so. If not, we will address your question at some point, or we may place it in the parking lot to answer at a later time during the presentation. Also, we will have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. Thank you, everyone, for attending this afternoon, and we hope you enjoy. At this time, I will turn it over to Mr. Boyce Wilson.
Why, thank you, Laura. Looks like everyone can hear me now, so we'll get started. Again, thank you, everyone, for your time. I know that in the emergency management world, time is a commodity that we often do not feel that we have. But I want you to understand the work that we do is very, very important. So our objectives and outcomes for this discussion, the things that we're going to talk about this afternoon are how to understand the many different characteristics of an emergency operations plan, the characteristics that make it a high quality emergency operations plan. And we are going to discuss the components of the basic plan, which is the foundation for your emergency operations plan. Throughout the discussion, I'll point you to a few resources along the way that hopefully will help you in not only writing your plan, but making it a high quality plan that integrates your district, individual campuses, various parts of the student body, and ultimately the community as a whole. So for a high quality emergency operations plan, we look for a number of different things. You see, there's a lot of emergency operation plans that are in existence that someone just pulled down a template, filled in the blanks, added a little bit of localized content, and then they roll it out the door with a signature to be the end-all, be-all for their emergency operations. However, to add the quality component to that plan to make sure it's truly functional, we look at whether or not our plans are data or assessment driven. And we'll talk about some of those various assessments in other webinars as we move forward. But when we think about data and assessments, we have a lot of data and a lot of assessments that are available to us, whether they be behavioral assessments within our districts, our hazard mitigation planning assessments that may be within our city or our county. We can even review the emergency plans that our cities and counties have to see what those entities are planning for. And we want to incorporate the data that we can gather about our school, about our students, about our faculty and staff, and about our community so that we can truly address the unique needs of our schools. A high-quality emergency operations plan should also contain SMART goals. So for those that have ever had the opportunity to participate in a leadership discussion, the conversation always comes back around to establishing goals. Goal-driven progress tends to be one of the most effective approaches for organizational development, and it's no different for emergency planning. You see, in our emergency operations plans, we need to have goals that address our needs and how we're going to go about doing those. And for a SMART goal to exist, each goal needs to be specific or unambiguous, measurable. We need to be able to benchmark our progress toward completion. Action-oriented. Whenever we have a goal, ultimately we need to be doing something. It needs to be realistic for the resources and the personnel that are assigned to achieve the goal. And it needs to be time sensitive. We need to have a completion date in mind. So when we start writing our emergency plan, we really begin with the end in mind. What do we want our students, our faculty, our staff to do? What's the appropriate responses when an emergency or a disaster occurs? And in order for that to happen, we need to have these goals that are benchmarked and time oriented, time sensitive, so that we can establish a process for getting where we need to be. Another thing that a high quality emergency operations plan should address is the National Incident Management System. Now, the National Incident Management System was mandated following the 9/11 attacks. The Homeland Security Presidential Directive number 5 and Presidential Policy Directive number 8 essentially established that anyone with emergency management or response capabilities and a responsibility to take action should adhere to the National Incident Management System. And one component of the National Incident Management System is the incident command structure. The incident command structure identifies how we assign roles and responsibilities on an emergency or on an incident or even a planned event. But we use some standardized terminology, and we use a couple of fundamentals to make sure that whether it be the school or your local fire department or even a county sheriff's office, that we're all speaking a similar language and we can work together effectively to take care of those who we're there to protect and serve. We mentioned the incident command system, and while it's listed as a separate bullet, the incident command system itself is one component of the greater National Incident Management System strategy. And believe it or not, NIMS itself is a document. However, within NIMS, we have a number of concepts that all marry together so that we work together efficiently and effectively. The incident command structure guides our functional approaches to managing emergencies. So if you think about the need to evacuate a school, evacuation is a function. And for every function, we have an element within our incident command system that should be responsible for carrying out those activities. And within that element or that unit of the command structure, we then assign additional resources to support the mission. And by taking a modular approach to breaking down our operations, we can visibly see how command and control should be established. Our emergency operation plans should address the whole school community. Now, I've mentioned whole community several times so far, and it was even mentioned during the introduction when I was introduced. For a very long time, emergency management was conducted in silos. So the law enforcement folks did their things, and emergency managers did their things. And in a school environment, we have educators doing one thing, and we had staff doing another. And ultimately, when a disaster strikes, what we find out, and we can see it prevalent on every evening news broadcast throughout the country, is that bad things cause people to come together. And if we're going to come together when bad things occur, it only makes sense that we begin planning with the idea in mind that we're going to work with others. And so we want to address our whole community, which are all parts of our student body, all parts of our faculty, all parts of our staff, including support staff. One thing you'll find out is no one knows the layout of the school, the nooks and crannies, better than custodial staff. They see it every day. And there's a lot of importance to bringing those folks to the table to have the discussion on emergency planning. Our emergency plans need to empower our staff and our faculty to take action. It's one thing to expect someone to do something. It is something completely different to empower them to do it. You see, when we assign roles and responsibilities in our emergency plans, and we'll talk about assigning those responsibilities in a little bit, but when we assign those responsibilities, we need to understand that we are giving them both the authority and the autonomy to make decisions in order to address the responsibilities we have given them. If we place someone in charge of facility evacuation, they need to be able to make the decision as to when and how to announce the evacuation. They need to have the autonomy to conduct that notification, and they need to have the authority to ensure that all of the various aspects are carried out. Our emergency plans should align vertically. Now, at the same time, we're going to talk about horizontal alignment. Our plans have to align both vertically and horizontally. Vertical alignment means that our emergency plans align to our school district structure. So it should align with our chain of command and the lines of authority within the school district. Horizontal alignment and horizontal integration means that, excuse me, means that our emergency plan should align and be applicable to not only the district as a whole, but to each individual facility or campus within the district. So there's certain parts of the plan that are going to be more specific, and we'll talk about annexes and appendices in a later presentation as well. But as we drill down into our emergency plan, the overarching basic plan addresses the district, and we ensure that there's caveats in place to address the individual needs of our campuses and our additional facilities so that we have a truly comprehensive emergency operations plan. So when it comes to writing your emergency operations plan in general, whether it's the basic plan or any other planning document that you work on, there's a couple of tips that will help guide you through a process that may seem overwhelming. The first is we want to ensure that our plan is user-friendly. Now, a little bit about my background. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in emergency management. And it doesn't make sense for me to write a very high-level, extremely technical document and have the expectation that anyone else other than me that reads the document can understand what I'm asking to be done. So we want to lay out our emergency operations plan in a logical manner that's user-friendly so that the documents are easy for people to find the information. It uses plain language so that people can understand what we're discussing and what actions we're setting in place. It should be actionable so that it specifically states what is being done and that there's a consistent flow of information. Now, we also find that when writing an emergency plan, documents that are extremely wordy, we use a lot of words, a lot of times those gather dust on a shelf. What we want to see is the words that are so important, but also some job aids such as checklists or pictures or visual cues that identify the key actions and the key steps addressed within the emergency operations plan. What that does is it helps us to train others on the plan and make it more understandable for those who are not emergency management practitioners. But it also allows us to use those when an emergency strikes or when a disaster occurs so that we have a quick reference to fall back on. And it helps us to essentially do our job, hence the term job aid. Our emergency plans should also be adequate. Emergency plans are designed to provide guidance to the district on any and all of the hazards or threats to which the district itself is exposed. And while the templates and the documents may seem overwhelming, it is very important that we work through a planning process and have the discussions to ensure that the needs of the district, and they are unique between districts, large districts and small districts, while they share many commonalities, there's also some unique issues that arise. And we want to make sure our plan addresses those unique attributes of the district. Therefore, our plan, if we do that, is adequate to address those issues moving forward. Our plan should also be feasible. All of the activities that we outline in our plan need to be achievable with the resources that are currently available to us. Now, I mentioned before about the need to set goals, and our goals should be both short-term and long-term. When establishing a long-term goal, it's perfectly acceptable to consider future development. However, in writing our emergency operations plan, we need to paint a very feasible and realistic picture of our current capabilities. And as we adapt our plan and as we grow as a district, we can update or revise our plan to address those new capabilities. But writing a capability into your existing plan for a capability that does not yet exist for you leads to confusion and ultimately causes a disconnect when we actually activate the plan. Also, when we write an emergency operations plan, we want to make sure that our plan is accepted. And we run into this issue even in the public safety and public venue side of the house. When an emergency operations plan or an emergency management plan is written, oftentimes that responsibility falls to one single individual or a small group of individuals. They put ideas together, they pass it up, it gets a signature, it gets approval, and then, or a formal approval, I should say. And then that becomes the guidance for responding to emergencies. The downside to that approach is if we don't ensure that our plan is accepted by all stakeholders, all of the folks that we expect to respond or react a certain or specific way to a situation, if we don't have their buy-in throughout the process, it's very hard for us to expect that they understand what they need to do when an emergency happens. So it's very important throughout the entire planning process that we have discussions with those stakeholders and ensure that they're on board and can accept what we're expecting of them to do. For example, if your school writes into your emergency plan that you're going to utilize the local special weapons and tactics or SWAT team with the police department in the event that there's civil disturbance, unrest, active shooter, or any other type of threat, that is perfectly acceptable. We know that those resources, upon request, respond when there's an emergency call. They will come out. But if that doesn't actually exist and we've never talked to the police department about whether they truly have a SWAT team, we may be writing resources and capabilities into our plan that we don't actually have immediate access to. So when we look at each of these 4 tips, they all interconnect, they're interrelated, and by addressing all 4, we're ultimately addressing each of the others and building a high-quality emergency operations plan. And so far, I say we don't have any questions, so I'm either doing really, really good or everyone's really, really quiet. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, or you're welcome to address them after the at the end of the call. So let's take a look at the layout or the organization of an emergency operations plan. An emergency operations plan is technically a series of documents that ultimately address all of our various needs. The basic plan is the very basis, fundamental foundation for developing all future emergency planning documents. And again, the basic plan itself is focused on the district, and then we can add additional functional and threat or hazard specific annexes. Make sure. So the basic plan of your emergency operations plan gives an overview of the school's approach to operations before, during, and after an emergency. This section addresses the overarching activities the school undertakes regardless of the function, the threat, or the hazard. So these are the common activities and the common expectations no matter what issue you face. The content in this section provides a solid foundation for all school operations, and the information in this section should not duplicate the information that we find in other parts of the plan. So for instance, if we establish a functional annex for evacuation, we need not address the specifics of evacuation within our basic plan. We can just reference the additional document. Let's see. Almost all the information that is contained within your basic plan should be able to come from your local emergency planning team that's a part of your district. So while one person may be responsible for entering information into the plan or actually writing the plan, it truly takes this planning team to come together and have the discussion as to how the school actually can and will respond to an emergency and prepare for emergencies before they happen. If the planning team finds that it needs to go outside of its members for a significant amount of information, that typically indicates that we need to add more people to our planning team. So if we're finding out that we're having to constantly seek out information regarding transportation within the district, that should be an indicator that we need to pull someone responsible or that has insight into transportation operations into our planning team. The basic plan also serves as the foundation for all of our functional annexes, such as shelter in place or evacuation or direction and control, as well as our threat and hazard specific annexes that address pipeline or hazardous material emergencies, train derailments, or even tornadoes or active shooters. Now, there are templates available for each of these documents on the high quality emergency operations planning toolkit that can be found on the Texas School Safety Center website. And I would be remiss if, while I'm very partial to the emergency operations planning toolkit, there are a number of toolkits that will benefit you as you start writing your emergency operations plan. There's a toolkit related to legal aspects. There's a toolkit related to training drills and exercises. And so there's a lot of information that you can leverage right from the Texas School Safety Center website to help you in writing your emergency operations plan. Why would I bring the toolkit up? Well, first, it may be very difficult for you to remember everything that we talk about over the next 45 minutes to an hour whenever you sit down to start writing your emergency operations plan. On top of that, you have all the external forces that are demanding of your time that will also detract. And so having access to the templates helps to build the foundational information, the foundational wording for your plan that you can then go back and customize. And by using the toolkits, you can get additional insight into each of the various activities and responsibilities of writing your plan. Now, the basic plan is composed of several sections. We have the first several of these authority, purpose, explanation of terms. These are the aligned with more of an introductory style content. We lay the ground rules for what our emergency operations plan addresses. And then we have a situation and assumptions that determine how we go about planning, a concept of operations that outlines what we do, and we'll talk about each one of these individually. Organization and assignment of responsibilities, direction and control, readiness levels, administration and support, as well as plan development and maintenance. Now, while these are the basic format, at the end of that list, you also have the opportunity to add additional annexes and appendices as you see fit to meet the needs of your district. So let's talk about introductory material. Showing you a table of contents is one thing, but once you open the template, then it quickly becomes overwhelming. So let's break this down piece by piece and see what type of information we need to provide to have a high quality plan. Introductory material enhances accountability with community partners, including your first responder organizations, your local emergency managers, and public and mental health officials, and it makes your emergency operations plan much easier to use. We begin with a cover page. The cover page is exactly that. It includes the title of the plan, a date, the school, district, and the campuses covered by the plan. And it really provides an opportunity for you to make the plan yours. I highly encourage you, as you're writing your plan, don't let any template that you use be the final product. Make the plan yours. Show ownership of the plan. And add something like logos or a photo background so that when others pick up your emergency operations plan, not only do they know who it relates to and what the document is, but they can see that there is care placed in every aspect of writing this plan. Ultimately, those small customizations make the document more important and more meaningful to those other stakeholders who need to read it and understand it. We have the promulgation document and signatures. So the promulgation document contains a signed statement formally recognizing and adopting the school emergency plan. It gives both the authority and the responsibility to school officials to perform their tasks before, during, and after an incident, and it should be signed by the school administrator or another authorized official. This document or this part of the plan is ultimately considered the final approval by your district leadership. The approval and implementation page introduces the plan, outlines its applicability, and indicates that it supersedes all previous plans. It also includes a delegation of authority for specific modifications that can be made to the plan and by whom they can be made without administrator signature. It also includes a date and should be signed by the authorized school administrator. This document ensures that those with responsibility have the authority and the autonomy to carry out the responsibilities assigned to them. The record of changes. The record of changes contains, at a minimum, a change number, the date of the change, the name of the person who made the change, and a summary of the change. Now, this document serves two very important purposes for us. First, it demonstrates progression in the planning efforts. So we can see, solely by looking at the record of changes, the amount of effort that a district and its planning team have put into the planning process. On top of that, the record of changes also gives us a reference point to see what specific emergency management areas have been addressed by the school and how they are evolving so that we can better plan not only within the school, but for our external stakeholders such as fire, police, EMS, and emergency management. The record of distribution indicates the title and the name of the person receiving the plan, or the people that we give the plan to, the agency to which the recipient belongs, whether it be a school office or if it's outside of the school, the name of the government agency or jurisdiction or the private sector company, the date in which it was delivered, and the number of copies delivered to that individual. Other relevant information could be considered, and the record of distribution can be used to prove that individuals and organizations with specified roles have acknowledged the receipt, review, and acceptance of the plan. Copies of plans can be made available to the public or the media by redacting sensitive information in accordance with public record laws. And the record of distribution reinforces to the planning team in the district how important it is for sharing the plan and educating others on the plan, especially when they have responsibilities assigned to them. And lastly, we have the table of contents. The table of contents is a logically ordered, clearly identified layout of the major sections and subsections of the plan that help with finding information when you're looking through this document. So these 6 items together are what are considered introductory material in an emergency planning document. Aside from the introductory material, we have a purpose and a situation overview. The purpose sets the foundation for the rest of the school emergency plan. The basic plan's purpose is a general statement of what the school emergency operations plan is meant to do. The statement should be supported by a brief synopsis of the plan and its annexes, and it should answer the question as to why we have a plan and why is having that plan important to the district and the community as a whole. The situation overview explains why a school emergency operations plan is necessary. Please understand there's a difference between important and necessary. Yes, the emergency plan is important, but it is also very necessary. The situation section covers a general discussion of the threats and hazards that pose a risk to the school and would result in a need to use the plan, and dependencies on parties outside of the school for critical resources. So if we have to rely on private contractors or local companies or even local response agencies, this gives us an opportunity to discuss the current situation that we face when planning and responding. The situation overview should answer the question as to the issues that make it necessary for us to have a plan. So together, the purpose and situation overview are going to, in short, answer why we have a plan, why the plan is important, and why the plan is necessary. The concept of operations. So the concept of operations section explains in broad terms the school administrator's intent regarding operations. It's designed to give an overall picture of how the school protects its students, its staff, and its visitors, and addresses a number of different things. So essentially, the concept of operations paints the picture as to what we're going to do before, during, and after an emergency happens. For me, I see the concept of operations as the meat and potatoes of your emergency plan. Even if this is the only piece that we see, we can get a better understanding of how a school is capable of taking care of its immediate and long-term needs. It should identify the authority or those individuals with the authority to activate the plan, such as school administrators and department heads, and what parts of the plan they can activate. So it may not be feasible to say that every teacher within the classroom can activate the plan in its entirety, but they may be able to activate a specific component of our plan, and that should be addressed in our concept of operations. It'll also identify other supporting response plans. So we look at the process that we coordinate with others and other response plans in place, not only within the district, but within our jurisdiction. So just as schools are required to have an emergency operations plan, so are cities and counties. And the city and county plans are very detailed documents and typically very large documents that are broken down in a very similar, almost identical way to our school emergency operations plan. We need to ensure that when we write our emergency plan, that it aligns horizontally with those plans as well, so that we're not duplicating efforts or stepping on top of one another as we prepare for, respond to, or recover from emergencies. The concept of operations should also describe your coordination process and how that you do business per se, how you interact and involve people within your planning process for the agencies, the boards, or the divisions within your city, your county, and ultimately your school district. This should answer the question as to how we respond together, how we work together, and how we share information and resources with one another. The concept of operations should also explain how plan or our emergency plan in the planning process meets the needs of individuals with disabilities and others with access and or functional needs. So federal law says that we are required to address these, and ethics say that we should want to address these. So no matter how we look at it, those with disabilities and those with access or functional needs are a very important consideration within our plan. Oftentimes, these individuals need additional accommodations to be better protected from the impacts of an emergency or disaster, and we need to ensure that we can address those essential accommodations as well as our general practice and our general operational issues. The concept of operations should discuss your purpose of actions conducted before an emergency happens. So the things that we do to either prevent an emergency from occurring, such as using or implementing fire extinguishers and fire suppression systems, or the things that we do to be better prepared for those incidents when they do occur, such as training our personnel and ultimately conducting drills and exercises that involve our student body. It should explain the purpose of our actions that we conduct during an emergency, such as the evacuation or shelter-in-place functions, and how we're going to get essential vital records from within the school and carry them with us in the event that we do have to leave the school. It should also explain the purpose of the actions that are conducted after an emergency. Things like reviewing our response and finding ways to make it better and implementing corrective actions. It should also address recovery, what documentation we're going to keep, and how we're going to use that to reduce losses to the district so that we can sustain our operations for the long term. Now, the concept of operations answers a lot of questions that individuals within our district have about how we respond to emergencies. Among those questions, we're going to be answering the question regarding triggers that constitute an emergency. We identify how we define an emergency and at what point we begin to take actions. It identifies how we respond together, how we work together, how we share information, as we discussed before. And it discusses things such as our risk management and risk reduction programs, how we address life safety, incident stabilization, and property preservation issues, and how we can recover from the financial, facility, resource, and process impacts after an emergency occurs. Now, I said before that the concept of operations was the meat and potatoes of our emergency operations plan. Well, if we're going to have meat and potatoes, then we probably need dessert to go with it. Dessert becomes a very important part of a true Southern meal. So the organization and assignment of responsibilities for me is at dessert. Just as we say we're going to carry things out, we can't say that something will happen if we don't identify someone to actually do the work that we expect. Whenever we address this particular section, we're going to give an overview of the broad roles and responsibilities of school staff, families, guardians, and our community partners, the folks such as first responders, emergency managers, public and mental health professionals, and others, and the organizational functions during all emergencies, before, during, and after. So individuals that the planning team may wish to include within this particular section include principals, other school administrative leaders, teachers, support personnel such as instructional aides, counselors, social workers, psychologists, nurses, maintenance staff, school resource officers, cafeteria workers, bus drivers. The list can go on and on based on the resources you have at your disposal. We also need to ensure that we have roles and responsibilities for our parents and guardians. This becomes pertinent, especially when we discuss reunification. The planning team may also wish to include community-based organizations that are represented in the emergency operations plan. So if we think about the various community organizations that we as a school interface with on a regular basis, we may have a PTA or a PTO organization. What role might they play before, during, or after an emergency? We may also consider local volunteer organizations active in disaster. Programs such as FEMA's Community Emergency Response Team or other volunteer programs that exist within the community. We may also consider faith-based organizations that are active during disasters, such as Lutheran Ministries, Catholic Charities, the Southern Baptist Men, and a number of others. These are all resources that your district may have access to. We also need to describe the formal and informal agreements that are in place. So describing these agreements allows for quick activation and the sharing of resources during an emergency. For instance, locations that we may need to evacuate to that are housed within a nearby business. Agreements may be between the school and the response groups, such as a mutual aid agreement between the fire department or the police department, neighboring schools, organizations, and businesses. And these agreements typically contain the memorandum of understandings that may exist, mutual aid agreements, contracts, provisions for emergency contracting, and other such topics. Direction, control, and coordination. So this section describes the framework for how we direct, we control, we coordinate people, we coordinate information, we coordinate assets and resources leading into, during, and while recovering from emergencies. This section is going to identify the incident command system structure that is utilized by the school. So this is that step in the process where we identify when a function needs to be carried out, who will be responsible for doing it, and how it will report through a chain of command to organizational leadership or leadership within the district. It should also identify the relationship between the school emergency plan and the district or the broader community's emergency management system. Ultimately, the school is almost like a jurisdiction within itself. However, just as cities and counties have relied for years on support from schools to respond to emergencies, schools often rely on our resources as well. There's not many schools that have a full-fledged fire department on their own campus. So obviously there needs to be a relationship between our plan at the school level and the plans of our cities or counties and how we can share those critical resources. It should also detail who has the control of resources, equipment, and the supplies needed to actually activate and implement our plan. So when we talk about describing broad roles and responsibilities of teachers during an emergency, for instance, and we look at that direction and control piece, teachers, we might list in our plan that teachers will be responsible for the supervision of students and shall remain with the students until directed otherwise. So ultimately, a very broad statement that addresses the general considerations or concerns that we have for what a teacher should be doing. We may also list that teachers' responsibilities include directing students to inside or outside assembly areas according to instructions provided by the incident commander or their designee. That's some of that ICS terminology. Accounting for students when class relocates to an outside or inside assembly area. Reporting missing students to the incident commander or their designee. Obtaining first aid services for students who may be injured. And if they're training or certified, or if they're trained and certified in first aid, we might also add in there that they render first aid as necessary. So that may be some sample language that you can include for a teacher within that direction and control. Again, we're looking very broadly at what's going to happen, and we narrow that down even more as we add to our emergency operations plan using annexes and other job aids. We'll discuss direction and control in an entirely separate annex that is considered a functional annex within the templates so that you can get a better understanding as to what information is being looked for. Information collection, analysis, and dissemination. Now, I mentioned at the start of this deal that our high quality emergency operations plans are driven by data. They're ultimately driven by our research into our community and the results of that research that paint a very accurate picture as to the social environment, the political climate, the resource availability climate that our school has. So this particular section is going to address the role that that information has in successfully allowing us to implement our activities before, during, and after an emergency. So this section is going to identify the types of information. So before an emergency, we may use weather reports. You may have membership on National Weather Service chat where you can discuss, current weather conditions or impending weather conditions directly with incident meteorologists. You may also rely on law enforcement alerts, weather radio alerts, crime reports, a number of other available sources of information prior to a disaster. During an emergency, some of those won't change. We're still going to be watching what the weather does immediately following the impact of a tornado. Or if we have to evacuate our school, weather's still going to play a role in that. So we're still using a lot of the very same sources of information. Now, sometimes the information we need changes once we move away from response and we look at the things that happen after a disaster or the recovery phase of an emergency. These particular sources of information might be mental health agency websites and hotlines, emergency management or relief agency websites, or hotlines that are established to address unique and individualized needs within our communities. Now, for each of those types of information that we identify, the before, the during, and the after, we want to ask a couple of questions. And ultimately, within our emergency operations plan, we want to answer these questions. First off, what is the source? Where are we getting information from? If a person were new to the district and something were to happen, an emergency or an incident, where can we go to get viable, credible, actionable information to help address our needs? If we know where to get it, the next step is who is the person that's going to be responsible for analyzing and using the information? You see, during an emergency, the times leading up to an emergency, and especially after the emergency, we're often overwhelmed with information. Social media has allowed us to get our hands on massive amounts of information in a very short time. Some of it is actionable and some of it's not. So who's going to analyze that information? And who are the people that need to receive the specific parts or the specific types of information that we can gather? We also need to evaluate how that information is collected and how we're going to share it out. Are we going to solely rely on the use of email systems? If there's information that parents or the community need to know, do we have some type of notification system that allows us to reach outside of the confines of our building walls? Are we going to utilize a website? We look at all the various ways that we communicate with others and we share information, and we figure out how to leverage that technology to support emergency management response and recovery activities. We also want to consider the format for providing the information to those who are going to use it. Ultimately, it may not be in our best interest to take a screenshot of Facebook and send it to someone that needs the information. We have to think about, if we were in that person's shoes, how would we want to see the information so that it has the most absolute value and the most utility to us? We also need to look at how often information is going to be collected and shared. And this threshold may change based on the phase of emergency you're in, whether you're preparing for, responding to, or recovering from an emergency. But we need to determine how frequently we're going to acquire the information and share it with others. I apologize, I'm trying to keep up with my note pages here. So training and exercise. I mentioned before that having a plan is one thing, and we can build the most high quality emergency operations plan that has ever existed. But if we don't train people on what the plan says, and we don't exercise the plan or validate the plan to ensure that it actually works the way we hope it will, then it's nothing more than time and energy that converts to paper that sits on a shelf. We have to ensure that we're training and exercising our plan. This particular section of the plan is going to describe the critical training and exercise activities that we as the district and we as a school are going to use to support the plan. And it should address those core training objectives and how frequently those are going to occur to ensure that our staff, our students, our faculty, our parents, and our community representatives understand the roles and responsibilities and ultimately our expectations for them when the plan is activated. This section is also going to establish the frequency of exercises to be conducted by the school. So what we're answering in this particular section is what we're training on and how often we're going to practice. So think about a fire drill. As far back as I can remember, we've been conducting fire drills in school. And the very first time that a student ever participates in a fire drill, they have no clue what to do. So they listen to the teacher and we convince them to get up as orderly as possible, and we exit the school in as orderly a manner as possible. And the kids are excited and they're not sure what to expect. And we get out outside somewhere and we gather around one another and we get accountability. Now think about how that process evolves from, say, the kindergarten student that has experienced a fire drill for the first time and the senior in high school who has done this at least once, if not more frequently, every single year throughout their 13 years in school. By the time they're a senior, the fire alarm goes off, they don't have to be told by the teacher. They gather whatever it is they're going to gather. They stand up and they should exit in an orderly manner and go outside and meet up wherever they're supposed to meet up and get accountability. It becomes second nature through muscle memory. So we want that same approach to be how we react when an emergency happens, so that we're calm, we're organized, things occur in as much order as possible, and the incident allows. We always know there's going to be some deviations from that, but the goal is to have the best understanding of what's going to happen before it actually happens. Now, in the process of doing these things, we also find the opportunity for improvement. So by conducting training and exercises, we can find out where we need to strengthen training, what training is working very well, and we can also identify parts of our plan that don't necessarily work the way that we thought they would. So for instance, if we have an emergency plan that says our students are going to evacuate to a, for instance, football field, do we have the ability to get all of our students to the football field from where they may be on campus? And once they're there, how are we going to organize students? Because if it looks like a big gaggle out there, then maybe we can add some organization to make this easier for our faculty and staff to get accountability of the students. So we have an opportunity every step of the way to find ways to improve our emergency management practices. Administration, finance, and logistics. Now, it's always interesting to discuss administration, logistics, and especially finance with someone that has never been through an emergency or a disaster. And the main reason is we don't often see the importance of these things until after the emergency has subsided. So we have a question: do you have a sample plan that we can see and use for guidance when making ours? Absolutely. The sample plan is located in the high quality emergency operations planning toolkit. I believe it is in, I'm shooting from the hip here. I'll pull it up on my computer while we're talking. I believe it's in section 2. So it's going to be in module 2, section, let's see. Let's see. Is there anybody from School Safety Center that might be able to help out and find that quicker than I can? Oh, here we go.
Voice, this is Laura Stone.
Oh, hi, Laura.
Hi there. If you're going to the toolkit, there's a search box up in the top right corner, and the quickest way to find that is just to type in, sample EOP, something like that, and it'll drop down automatically. Some variations of the plan, a sample one, a template one, and so forth. So again, just using that search box in the top right corner of the toolkit will be the quickest way to access that.
Awesome. Thank you, ma'am. Laura always bails me out when I need help. So, and I think in the toolkit, if my notes serve me correctly, that's section 2, module 4, where it talks a lot about the EOP development and what the components of the emergency plan are. Much of the information that we're talking about right now in this discussion. Hopefully that answers your question, and if not, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be glad to discuss it more in depth. So administration, finance, and logistics covers the general support requirements and the availability of services and support for all types of emergencies, as well as our general policies for how we manage resources. And it's going to identify policies and procedures that exist outside of the emergency operations plan. So when we write our emergency plan, we have certain things within our plan that we perceive as being gospel. However, everything that we do in emergency planning relates to the policies and procedures that enable us to do our job. So almost every school district out there, I would imagine, has a purchasing policy. And that purchasing policy specifically states what the school can do in terms of spending money and what they need to do before they spend money and what paperwork they need to track as they spend money and how to ensure the district knows what money they've spent. And so those particular policies and practices exist outside of our emergency plan, but they're also um, very relevant to our plan itself. So the administrative controls and requirements piece identifies things such as the budget and acquisition policies and procedures and how those will be utilized to provide accountability for resources and expenses. And again, the focus is on policy and procedure. There we go. It should also describe the method for maintaining activity logs. So the activity logs become very, very important for us. So in this particular part, we want to describe how vital records, such as student records, are preserved. Some of that information may very well be located in our continuity of operations plan, or COOP annex that's associated with our emergency plan. But it becomes very important that we identify what is happening and who is doing what throughout a disaster. And the reason for that is we're also going to be tracking the financial records. So we want to identify the policies for those financial records and track our resource needs, the source and the use of the resources, what resources that we acquired ownership of or purchased, and what compensations we had to make for private property that was utilized by the school. Because if an emergency or disaster is large enough, the district can notify the city or county that disaster conditions have occurred on the campus or within the district. At the same time, the district can request a disaster declaration be made to the governor. The governor can pass it up. And eventually, as we go through this process, there's a possibility that state or federal monies may be able to assist the district in recovering those costs lost as a result of the disaster. The only way that we can get the district's hands on those recovery dollars is by keeping up with those activity logs, those vital records, and those financial records, because we have to paint a picture of who was doing what resources they used, and what the costs were associated with their activities. And by proving that, we open the door for a better opportunity to recover rather than shooting from the hip or taking a guess as to what a disaster actually cost the district. Plan development and maintenance discusses the overall approach to planning and the assignment of plan development and maintenance responsibilities. You see, the emergency operations plan is a living, breathing document. Just as you and I are living and breathing, unless you're in a lunchtime coma, just as we're living and breathing and we continue to grow, so will our emergency operations plan. We're going to develop new capabilities as time progresses. If you think back just 25 short years ago, we didn't have access to electronic messaging from classroom to classroom. Now, there is almost an expectation that that capability exists. And as technology evolves, as our capabilities evolve, and as people change places and we find better ways to do things, we need to update our emergency operations plan to reflect that. So within this particular section, we're going to look at the administrative controls and the requirements for plan maintenance. So it should describe the planning process, the participants of our planning process. Let's see, we have a mixed slide there. That's all right. So our plan development and maintenance section should address the planning process, who participated in the planning process. So at a bare minimum, we need to identify who served on the planning team when the plan was developed. But also, if we held a meeting within the district or on each campus to discuss emergency operations with our parents and with our community stakeholders, we also want to include that we pulled their insight, we pulled their knowledge and expertise in and considered it in the development of our plan. We also need to address how development and revision of the different sections of the emergency plan are coordinated before an emergency. So ultimately, we're answering the question, who did the planning and how did you do it? The plan development and maintenance section should also assign responsibility for the overall planning and coordination to a specific position or a person. Now, we know that we're going to have a planning team, or I would hope that we have a planning team that focuses on updating or writing or revising our plan. However, we need to have a single point of contact that is responsible for pulling those key stakeholders together. It should answer the question, who is responsible for making sure that the plan is maintained and updated, as well as that our planning process is sustained year after year. It should also provide a regular cycle of training, evaluating, reviewing, and updating the emergency plan. In this case, we're answering the question, how often will we go through the planning process to make revisions, and how often will we validate our plan through exercise? The authorities and references section provides the legal basis for our emergency operations and our activities. So throughout our entire emergency operations plan, we discuss a lot of different things. It's a very comprehensive document. We talk about, how we're going to use resources and how we're going to capture costs and how we're going to notify people. But at the end of the day, we have to have some authority to do that. And this is a section where we give the reader a list of the things that empower us to be able to do the things that need to occur before, during, and after an emergency. It should list any relevant emergency laws, statutes, ordinances, executive orders, regulations, and formal agreements that exist. Now, I want to point you to another resource on the Texas School Safety Center website, and that is the School Safety Law Toolkit. So if you're like me, we're probably not attorneys. And it would make sense if we had a single place that we could go to find all of the laws that are relevant to school safety and the things that we're trying to enhance as we write our emergency operations plan. It just so happens the School Safety Center has built an amazing toolkit, that School Safety Law Toolkit, that introduces those various legal components and how they impact our districts throughout the state of Texas. It should also provide for the succession of decision-making authority and operational control. So, this section ensures that critical functions can be performed in the absence of the school administrator. Again, when an emergency happens, all authority and autonomy within the district rests with the school administrator unless it's otherwise delegated. But I ask you the question, what happens when the school administrator isn't on campus? What happens when they're at a conference? Or, worst case scenario, what happens when they are a victim of the disaster and cannot respond in the capacity that they need to following an emergency? And that's where the importance of this succession comes in. Now, typically when we develop succession for that school administrator, we want to have that line of succession be at least 3 individuals deep. The reason that we go 3 people in addition to the school administrator is that gives us a total of 4 people that, if the previous person is not available, inherit the autonomy and the ability to command, control, and coordinate activities across the district and delegate those responsibilities to those with the need for action. Now, since we started, I've mentioned school as a general term, and I've mentioned district. You see, the basic plan is a district-focused document. It addresses the generalities across the entire district. However, each of our campuses have their own unique attributes. An elementary school often functions substantially different than our high schools in terms of how we instruct students, where the students are located at any given time, the amount of supervision over a student in between class periods, and other such things. So we can take it a step farther, and after we develop a basic emergency operations plan, we can add a campus plan that addresses the individual campus and their unique needs. And you'll notice that when comparing the table of contents between these two documents, they are very similar. The awareness, situation, and assumption section will often match that of the district's plan. Now, you may have some additional assumptions or an additional part of the situation statement that addresses the unique attributes for why you needed to have a separate document in the first place. But a lot of this will carry over from your district to your campus plans. But I want you to pay particular attention to the bottommost item on the campus table of contents list. That lists the attachments or the job aids and the standard operating guidelines, otherwise known as standard operating procedures, for that particular campus and how they will adapt the overall goal of protecting our students and our property and our faculty and our staff and our community, how they're going to adapt that to meet the unique attributes of their own campus or their own facility. Now, it also does not have to stop at just the campus. While we're looking at a campus, we may also have some other facilities that are very unique and may need an additional plan or an additional supporting document as well. For instance, transportation depots where our buses may be housed. Oftentimes they keep fuel on hand. Oftentimes they have other hazardous materials. Most of the time they probably do not have students at those facilities. We may look at our agricultural shops, our ag shops, or other remote locations within our district that we have control over and develop documentation to support how they will deal with the before, during, and after activities related to an emergency. There we go. Lost my mouse. I apologize. So with that being said, I know we covered a lot of information. We also covered a lot of information in a very short time. I highly encourage you to check out the high quality emergency operations planning toolkit, as well as the other toolkits that are housed on the Texas School Safety Center website, and refer to the information there. But with that being said, I would love to entertain some questions from you and try to help you get moving down the road to writing your own emergency operations plan. So I see Dennis Womack has asked, does the requirement to implement emergency plans and security measures that address polling places in schools go in the district plan or the individual campus plan or both? Dennis, that's a very good question. So we have to have the plans and the measures that address polling places. The first question I would ask is whether every campus is going to be a polling place. And if every campus is going to be a polling place, then we may be able to address that in the overarching basic plan or the district plan. If only a few of the campuses are going to have that, then it may be better placed within the individual campus plans. Now, if we're going to address something in the campus plan, we need to at least reference that information in our basic plan. And so the way we would do that is under concept of operations, we might add a little subsection in there for polling places. And we discuss the generalities of our safety measures that are going to be put in place across the board at any campus. And then when we work on our campus plan, we specifically state what functions, where the locations are going to be, how they're going to be conducted, and we address the specificities of that particular activity. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Thank you, Dennis. Any other questions? No questions.
Okay, at this time, we're going to wait just maybe another minute or two and see if we have any other questions coming in. While you're thinking and typing those questions out, everyone, we just want to remind you about a few things with the evaluation that will be sent to you. Probably by tomorrow afternoon, you will get a follow-up email with a link to the evaluation for this webinar. Once you complete the evaluation and submit it back to us, you'll receive another email, and that second one will have the link to the handouts for this webinar. So again, be looking for another email from us, a follow-up email by tomorrow afternoon, and that will contain the evaluation link. Once you submit that, you will receive another link back from the Texas School Safety Center, and that second link will be the link that will contain the handouts for this webinar.
All right, so is now a good time to jump back in with another question? All right, so the question was asked, where do you suggest we start when we are starting from scratch? That is a very, very good question. Superficially, I would definitely say start from the templates that are available on the school safety or the Texas School Safety Center's website, mainly because it can help you in developing some of that wording or give you some sample wording for developing a plan. I encourage that you start with your basic plan for the district so that you can have that discussion as to what generalities occur and what you should address. What I found out is simply downloading the template and starting to write, while some have been successful in that approach, many struggle. And so it's often better to just start with that planning meeting, get your key stakeholders together, your local response agencies, your some of your staff from within your school, and have the discussion. Pick a hazard that you know can happen, and have what we would call a tabletop exercise. Have that discussion for if this were to happen, what are we going to do? Who's doing what at this point in time, and see what everybody thinks, because what happens is you're identifying some of those functions that will guide you to other such activities, such as evacuation annexes and things of that nature. And so, start with that discussion and how we respond and build from there to build out that basic plan first. And then you can get into the specifics of evacuation annexes or tornado annexes or other things. But, the understanding is the way we respond to one disaster is very similar to the way we respond to anything else. For instance, an active shooter in a school as compared to a tornado, we know we still need to get accountability of students and faculty and staff. We still know that we need to make a decision as to evacuate or shelter in place or lockdown, things of that nature. And so start with that discussion to get the ball rolling forward. Let's see. Should the district police department be involved with the emergency planning? Absolutely. So if you have a district police department or school resource officers, or even a police department in the community or a sheriff's office, bring them to the table. First, they have very specialized training in responding to emergencies. Some may even have training in the preparing for and recovering from emergencies piece, but they most commonly will have an understanding of NIMS and ICS. They can understand and can share with you how they react and respond to emergencies. And so there's some very important insight that we can get from those individuals that otherwise we would just speculate on. And speculation leads to inadequate, inaccurate plans. So absolutely bring your police department to the table. I also encourage you bring your fire department, your local ambulance service at a minimum to the table as well. Small school, 2 campuses. Can we use one main district plan since the overall process will be the same for both campuses, but just add addendums for each campus, such as diagrams for building evacuations, fire drills, bad weather drills, and so forth? That's a really good question. So while the standards don't specifically state thou shalt have an individualized document for every campus, the standard is that your emergency plan be accurate and it be adequate for the threats and the hazards that you face on each of your campuses and throughout your district. So if you're able to write a district-wide basic emergency operations plan that addresses the unique attributes of both campuses, then by all means, we want to keep our plan simple, straightforward, and understandable. And then you add your addendums to the campus specific things or your drills or your functions using some of those functional and hazard specific annexes. But I encourage you, rather than looking at the aspect of number of documents, I encourage you to look at adequacy and place yourself in the shoes of an individual that works on a specific campus and make sure that it adequately addresses their needs for planning and response prior to making that decision. It is my pleasure, Aaron. Anyone else have a question?
Okay, at this time, we just want to make sure to say thank you once again for joining us. And we've already mentioned the evaluation email attachment that will be coming your way by tomorrow afternoon. And again, we thank you for joining us this afternoon. And hopefully we will visit with you again next week for our next webinar. Mr. Boyce Wilson will also be presenting that one on functional and hazard specific annexes.
Thank you all for your time.
This is my contact information. This is Laura Stone speaking, and Tom Kelly's as well. We're both school specialists here at the Texas School Safety Center. Should you have any other additional questions that you would like to ask us, or perhaps in a few days you're thinking over the content and you'd like to visit about a specific question, please don't hesitate. Give us a call, give us an email. We'll be glad to visit with you about content. We appreciate your questions. Again, we thank you for joining us today. This concludes our webinar.